Welcome back to GBN America with me, Patrick Christys, and it's debate time because Joe Biden is pushing ahead with his economic strategy. The election is looming large. So, who is Bidenomics going to benefit? Is he responsible for some of the hardships that people are facing, or has he largely done a very, very good job? Here to duke it out for us today are Ethan Behrman, who is, of course, the owner and attorney at the Behrman firm, and also Vince Coglianese, who is a radio show host in Washington, D.C. Chaps, thank you very, very much. So Bidenomics. Now, as far as I can tell, the pros appear to be things like infrastructure investment, focus on climate change, support for families, increased regulation. The cons, higher taxes, government spending, regulatory burden and dependency on government programs. I will start, though, by asking you, Ethan, the headlines suggest that inflation is easing and gas prices are slowly going down. Why is it then that ordinary Americans say they feel worse off? 55% of them, to be precise.
Which study you're reading. So the University of Michigan in January released a poll that showed that 52% of people in Michigan feel better off than they were 5 years ago. 62% of Americans feel like their individual personal finances are doing well. It's when you look at the overall economy, because if you're going to pound like Vince does on the bad news, and focus on that exclusively without looking at how things happen in a bigger picture, of course, you're going to have some people who believe that the economy is in worse shape. However, Patrick, as you're probably far too familiar, the United States has the strongest economic growth, the strongest wage growth, and the lowest inflation of all of the G7 nations. I feel bad for my friends in the UK. We have the best economy of the industrialized world right now. So overall, the economy is actually doing very well. That doesn't mean that individual people aren't having bad experiences with certain places closing and whatnot, and their experiences are real and absolutely affect them.
All right, Vince, I'll get you to come back on that then. He says that you're just pounding on the bad news and that most people are absolutely fine.
There's a thinking, I think, certainly within the White House, but definitely within Washington among Democrats, that the American people don't realize how good they have it and that their economic depression right now is just in their head, that everything is much better than it actually seems to them. And that's just not true. I mean, the reality is Americans don't need the government to tell them about the state of the economy. They can look at their own bank accounts. They can look at their own expenses. And the reality is now Americans are poorer than they were 4 years ago, 5 years ago, definitely. And what that means is their money doesn't travel as far. Yes, their wages are up, but their prices are up too much in order for them to pay for those things. Additionally, 60% of Americans are now living paycheck to paycheck. We've got credit card debt that is over $1.1 trillion right now. Those credit card interest rates are in the vicinity of 25, 28%. And Americans are losing full-time jobs. You know, we keep talking about the unemployment numbers in the country, and I am encouraged when Americans are working. But if you look under the hood, what you realize is that Americans are losing full-time jobs, and they're taking multiple part-time jobs in order to make ends meet. That's not the sign of a healthy economy. That's the sign of Americans who are hustling to make it in a tough economy.
Okay, Ethan, do you want to come back to that? It sounds as though actually people are having to work harder to keep their heads above water.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Vince just exemplified exactly what I opened with. He's not correct, factually not correct. Americans are better off. Wages are up. Yes, there was an inflation spike post-COVID. However, overall, wages are up. People are making more money. The actual comparison between wages still exceeded inflation. That's what the facts show. Americans, as I cited, personally report in a Quinnipiac poll to the University of Michigan. In Michigan, key swing state, show that their personal finances, 62% say they're better off. Again, he's not wrong. Vince is not wrong that the move to the gig economy, which has absolutely nothing to do with presidential policies from either his beloved president, Trump, or my president, our president, Biden, have nothing to do with the shift to the gig economy. That's called the marketplace at work. However, 2 quick points. Manufacturing has had its greatest recovery since World War II after a recession, and that is due mostly to President Biden's policies of the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act bringing manufacturing home.
Okay, so we've got some examples there from Ethan about Biden's direct involvement in what he would see as economic benefits. Vince, can I ask you, have you got any cast iron examples of Joe Biden's policies making people worse off?
For sure. And in fact, I'll cite one that Biden himself kind of admitted to in late 2021. He was giving a speech in the Port of Baltimore, and he was talking about that first stimulus package that he signed into law when he came into office. It was in the vicinity of $2 trillion in new COVID so-called relief funds. These were unnecessary federal government expenditures paid for by literally printing the money and thus spiking inflation yet again. Biden would say in that speech that the effect of that, he said, ironically, is people have more money now, but when you have more money, there are fewer goods to spend that money on, and as a result, prices go up. He was right about the fundamental economics. The government spending by Joe Biden and his Democrat colleagues has led to that big inflation that has left Americans poorer since the pandemic than they were 4 years ago. So it's not a good thing. And in fact, we're at a point where we're approaching $35 trillion in debt. Congress may not actually raise taxes literally, but it is taxing the American people through inflation, through printing money by way of the Federal Reserve. And that's a bad thing. That leaves Americans struggling.
Okay, Ethan, I mean, apparently that's a bad thing. It's going to leave Americans struggling. Biden is responsible for all of that. The bubble's going to burst at some point.
Yeah. Again, Vince conveniently ignores that initial spending when COVID hit was actually under President Trump and his proposal. It was continued by President Biden and increased. Furthermore, let's talk about President Trump's economic policies that increased the debt and the deficit spending in a hot economy at the greatest time in U.S. history. Before COVID. So President Biden, by the way, he's not wrong that putting money in people's pockets, which Vince just contradicted himself by saying that, is a good thing, that we want people to have money in their pockets. Yes, that can drive inflation. However, the data show, and there's a report, that in 2023, the inflation, 53% of it is attributable to corporate profit taking. Excess profits by large corporations, multinational corporations, preying upon the consumers. That's nothing to do with the president. That has to do with greed.
Look, I'm happy to go after corporations, but that's a canard, unfortunately, because what you have is you had the companies paying dramatically higher prices than they were passing on to their own consumers. In fact, they were insulating consumers from the price increases that they were experiencing for some time. Now they're on about par. And the average company in America is now paying 18% higher prices for the goods that they're taking in and producing. And then Americans are paying approximately 18% higher prices as well. It's on parity. In other words, they're not taking advantage of them. Americans are just paying the higher prices that these companies have to pay in the first place.
Yeah.
All right, look, Vince, I'll stick with you on this, and then I'll. All right, okay. We'll knock it on a little bit because we're pressed for time. We might end up with President Trump at some point, relatively soon. So, Vince, I'll ask you. You've said a lot of things there that, in your view, Biden has done wrong and that have made people poorer. Can you give us any examples of what Donald Trump would do to make people better off?
Well, I would hope, and I say this as somebody who is critical of Trump, and if I had the opportunity on the specifics, yeah, I don't like the debt going up, including pre-pandemic under Trump, and I'd like that to be controlled, because I think that the kind of the fantasy land that Washington has occupied, both Democrats and Republicans in many cases, is that we can spend money with abandon and that there are no consequences for that. That's just not true. I mean, obviously, we're experiencing it now by way of inflation. So I think Trump does have an obligation to bring the debt under control. He made promises that he would do that prior to his first presidency. He's got a very good chance now at a second presidency, and getting that under control would result in human flourishing here in the United States. That would be a good thing to do, and I'd be all for it.
Ethan, if it is President Trump, okay, in a few months' time, then there is a chance that he's going to start saying some stuff a bit like America first, and he is going to maybe reduce things like foreign expenditure. He is going to maybe start banging the drum and say, I'm going to spend less on illegal immigrants and all of that stuff. All of that will sound very appealing, I imagine, to a lot of Americans. How on earth would Biden combat that?
Yeah, no, look, I want to just point out very quickly, Patrick, I agree with Vince on a really critical topic. $35 trillion of national debt is a major looming problem for the United States of America. Both parties have abjectly failed over the last 20 years when it comes to deficit spending. Republicans and Democrats alike need to do a much better job and keep an eye on this national debt. It's a serious, serious problem. However, I want to point out, President Trump spent as much on foreign spending as any prior president. It's actually Joe Biden that passed legislation to restrict how we spend money overseas, bringing that manufacturing back home, bringing chip manufacturing back home. President Trump, while rightfully taking on China, I don't think he did it the right way. President Biden has continued that and actually done a very good job and has actually proposed the legislation that Republicans wanted when it comes to things like the border. And then magically Trump has claimed that he doesn't want that legislation passed. Look, controlling our border is important. Controlling the deficit spending is very important. I have no faith that Donald Trump would do any better at it in a second term. I would fear a rise of more fascism and his desire for a dictatorship.
Right. Okay. No, I'm going to just let Vince have the very final word on this then. So, I mean, there were some quite strong allegations there, Vince, about the rise of fascism and a desire for a dictatorship, which I think is probably worthwhile to come back to.
Yeah, because I think it's absurd. I'm confident in that, in fact, because, look, Trump is the one who wants to appear on ballots and have the people choose him. He's the one who did leave office on January 20th, 2021. He flew to Mar-a-Lago. There was the transfer of power. I mean, the whole thing is nuts, actually. And meanwhile, the left is trying to remove him from presidential ballots, to trying to use the justice system to prevent him from having a candidacy. They're imprisoning their political opponents. Just the idea that fascism is projected on Trump, I think, is absurd, and it's unfortunate in American politics. When it comes to what's going to happen in a Trump presidency, I just think it's critical that he be focused on getting that debt down. Because look, Joe Biden just put a budget forward, a proposed budget, as all presidents do. And that budget suggests that by the end of 2 terms of Biden's presidency, he will have raised the national debt by $14 trillion. That is not sustainable. That will be the single highest payment that the United States government has to pay for. And that comes right from Americans and their ability to afford anything.
Look, guys, we wanted to debate. We got a debate. Thank you very, very much. That was absolutely fantastic stuff. I know a lot of people will have learned a heck of a lot from that. As Ethan Behrman there is an owner and attorney at the Behrman firm, and Vince Coglianese there as well, who's host at Washington, D.C.'s popular news talk radio station 105.9 WMAL, and the editor of the Daily Caller. Chaps, thank you very, very much. I will see you next time on GBN America. All the best. Well, I'm very pleased to be joined now by Peter Dunn, who is the CEO of Your Moneyline and the host of the Pete the Planner podcast. Thank you very much for joining us here on GBN America. Look, we live in incredibly, difficult economic and financial times for a lot of people. I know a lot of people will be wanting to know, how on earth can they stabilise their finances? So have you got any tips for them?
Absolutely. And it's a pleasure to be with you. You know, in 2020, when the world sort of shut down around COVID, we were all forced to re-examine our financial lives. So we had this great motivation, fear, that caused us to make some really good financial decisions. So Patrick, to your point now, in 2024, we don't have anything quite hanging over our head like COVID, but at least in the United States, we've got a presidential election, which also could coincide with a constitutional crisis. A person should feel more motivated than ever to take control of their personal finances. And I hate to say it, it starts with a budget. It is the best place to start, especially in uncertain times.
Okay, so look, what are the best ways for people to budget, especially if they've got a mortgage to pay, maybe they're paying off a car, they want to put a bit of savings away as well. There's a lot of high interest rates flying around at the moment. So how can people not just keep their heads above water, but actually put some stuff away for a rainy day?
Most people should look back on the last 90 days of spending and see what they have spent, and then just classify those categories. This is what I spent on housing. This is what I spent on groceries. This is what I spent on transportation, as a starting point, because some Americans are going to find out that what they're currently doing isn't good. And so you got to start there. And then at that point in time, you've got to start to budget in savings while also reducing some transactions that we've become accustomed to over the last 3 or 4 years.
What about debt? Should people be prioritizing paying off high interest debt, or actually should they not be doing that at the moment and maybe wait for it to subside a little bit?
Great question. It really depends on how high of interest we're talking about. As we all know, global interest rates have come up, and that's to suggest that a mortgage at 7% right now in the United States isn't the worst thing in the world. So I wouldn't hurry up and pay that down. However, if you've got a credit card debt at 29, 30%, that is something that you would want to aggressively pay down. So it is all relative, knowing that mortgage rates in our country were a few years ago at 2%. Just because they're at 7 or 8 now doesn't mean that you need to aggressively pay down that debt.
Let's just have a little look at some people who might be, fortunately, slightly better off. People who are looking to invest, okay? So not your super wealthy, your average Joe who's got a little bit of spare cash. Maybe they've come into some money and they're wondering about where they should put that to get a lot of return on that investment.
Yeah, I think it has to do with defining your goals and identifying what you're trying to accomplish. Most novice investors would say, I want the most return that I can get. Give me the highest return, when in fact that's kind of a bad idea, because it won't help you make a better investment decision. For me, I'm happy with 8 to 10% annually. Does that make me a boring person? Arguably, but that's a different question altogether. But I would say it allows me to make better investment decisions. So if you got money to invest, don't just say, hey, I want this to be the most it can be, because that actually makes investing harder.
Yeah, that is interesting. Is that about the level, do you think, that people should be aiming for? If they can make about an 8% increase on what they've got in their investments, do you think that's the kind of target that people should be looking for?
Absolutely. Usually I hedge on an answer like that. I wouldn't say absolutely, but I mean it. 8 to 9 to 10% is a great rate of return on average. It means you're going to double your money. You're going to double your assets every 9 years or so based on that return. And I know that we want to get rich quick. The cryptocurrency and Bitcoin has us feeling like we're all going to be crypto millionaires overnight. But the reality is, if you can double your money in 8 or 9 years, that's amazing. And you can do that with an 8 or 9% rate of return.
You mentioned a little bit earlier on about the upcoming election and what that may or may not mean. Obviously, we can't predict the future, but I'll just ask you the same question for both potential winners, I suppose, really. If Trump does get in, who could it benefit, do you think, and what potential problems could there be? So both sides of that coin.
Sure. I think the stock market will continue to rise. Here's the thing. Under Trump's presidency, February 19th of 2020, the market had reached an all-time high. Well, it kind of happens almost every presidential administration. So that has happened under Biden too. So I think with Trump, you'll see that the stock market continue to rise. I think you will see geosocial unrest in the United States to some degree, depending on if there is a constitutional crisis leading up to that. If President Biden is reelected, I think, again, you're going to see the market rise. But I think you're going to see the government go deeper into debt from a budgetary standpoint. That's not to say I prefer one or the other, but I think no matter what, you're going to see the stock market continue to rise due to these economic conditions. And it's just how many jobs are created, I think, could be the difference between the two administrations.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just ask you to focus a bit more on Biden now as well, then, when it comes to that. So, you don't really think, by the sounds of it, unless I misinterpreted what you've had to say there, it doesn't sound to me as though you're predicting a huge economic shift one way or the other, depending on who walks into the White House in the new year.
I think the only large economic shift we're going to see is if there is a constitutional crisis. I think if we get to a point where it's in doubt of who won, you're going to see some really bad effects of that. Otherwise, I think the trajectory of the economy is determined at this point, and certainly the stock market as well. I don't see massive growth coming on the tails of either of those two gentlemen winning.
Can I just ask you one final one? It's a little bit left field, this, but I think the way that things are here in Britain at the moment, there can often not be, with incredibly high tax, an incentive for people to go and start a bit of a side hustle. They think, well, I'll have to get out of bed earlier in the morning, I'll have to put more work in, and I might get taxed at, say, 45% of that or something. And so they think, well, there's not that much of a point doing it. What's the situation like over America? What would your advice be to somebody who's looking to top up their basic income by starting some kind of side hustle, and what kind of areas would you recommend they maybe go into?
I love that question. Thanks for asking it. I still think the side hustle is alive and well here in the States. People still really value that. I will note that tax is not a disincentive here in terms of a side hustle. If people want to do that, number one, there's so many things like food delivery or Uber or Lyft that a person can do. That's sort of what people have done in the last few years. But of course, I would encourage people to see if their own professional skills combined with AI can create a job opportunity for them that way. I think that will be the next 5 years, is side hustles will be driven and supported by AI, not just delivering fish and chips to your neighbor because they don't want to go out and pick it up themselves.
Peter, thank you very much. Thoroughly enjoyed that. And I do hope to talk to you again very soon. That's Peter Dunn there, the CEO of Your Moneyline and the host of the Pete the Planner podcast. Thank you very much for joining us on GBN America.
My pleasure.
Okay, well, thank you very much for tuning in to GBN America. If you want the very latest from America, there really is only one place to be, and that is gbnews.com/America. I'll see you next time.